Hey guys, welcome back to Film Recap here today. I am going to explain a movie called Handmaiden. In the 1930s, a young woman walks by on a rainy day in Japanese-occupied Korea. The name Akju was adopted by her family to serve a wealthy Japanese family. She should be one. A female servant named Mrs. Hideko. When they arrived at the mansion, they met an old lady. Inform Akju of her house policy. Akju is also getting her new name to keep her consistent. Japanese theme of this house, Tamako. After a short but concise self-introduction, the old lady guides Tamako to a new room directly across from the lady's room. Then, in the middle of the night, a woman's sharp scream echoed throughout the house. Tamako wakes up to comfort a poor lady who is plagued by nightmares. After this, Tamako. She rests beside the lady and sings her lullaby. The next day, Tamako becomes a woman. It was a letter from her ex-lover, whom she used to serve. After the old woman leaves her room, Mrs. Hideko tells her Tamako that her head hurts. A series of reading exercises with her uncle takes place each time she reads her book. Like that, the woman gives the letter to Tamako and asks her to read it. But Tamako reveals that she cannot read. She realizes it's time to practice reading again, and Mrs. Hideko tells her Tamako to pick it up later. Around noon, Tamako goes to the library of her mansion to pick up the young lady. When Tamako tries to enter the library, Mrs. Hideko's uncle yells at her. "Don't step over her." The woman then closes her gate to prevent Tamako from actually entering. Back at the mansion, the woman vomits. She tells Tamako that she is not sick. Rather, her vomiting is due to book boredom. She said she had read it before and was uncomfortable with it. While giving her lady a bath, Tamako tells her, "Hideko when the Earl comes to the mansion." Mrs. Hideko seems to be suffering from sharp teeth, and Tamako quickly fixes this by smoothing the woman's teeth. Tamako, on the other hand, cannot. Help her admire her feminine beauty. Then finally the Count arrives. Gentlemen, the Count assures Mrs. Hideko that the painting task will be successful, and he turns his attention to the maid of his choice. The Earl then gives Tamako a coin and takes her out of the room. In the next scene, the Earl himself calls Tamako to her room and instructs her to do something. After acquisition. So a noble and prestigious Earl cartwheels out of nowhere. Not distinctive. Tamako angrily tells the Earl that she was really trying to trick him with a counterfeit coin. In a sudden turn of events, Tamako reveals through a flashback that she comes from a family of scammers. Flashback shows the Count. Discuss plans. The plan is to break into a rich man's house and make his niece. She fell in love with the Count and married him. Put her in a mental institution so that her Earl can carry on her legacy, said her niece. She is Hideko. If the plan succeeds, the family gets a share of the money. Tamako got the largest share. Returning to the present, the Earl pardons. Before moving forward with the plan, Tamako has some instructions. He gives. Tamako presents the woman with earrings. After that, Hideko-sama dressed up, an event caused by the presence of the Earl, when he helped a beautiful woman into the dining room. Tamako silently admires this walking goddess. After dinner, Hideko will go home, Tamako's room, so she comes up with her brilliant idea to make her Tamako beautiful with her clothes. After she dressed Tamako, the woman said that Tamako also resembled a real woman. As the two undress each other, Tamako tries to persuade the woman to get married. However, Mrs. Hideko immediately cut off the conversation. The next day, Tamako tells Hideko that there will be a party to draw her, with her Count, and I feel sorry for Hideko, who follows the Count's plan little by little. After the painting is over, the Earl tells Tamako the key word, "It's time." The Count and Mrs. Hideko are left alone. When I went for a walk in a quiet place in the forest, Mrs. Hideko tells her Tamako that her mother died after giving birth. She added, "She was never born." When Tamako hears this, she immediately tells the woman, "That's your mother. Don't regret having her." Tamako then leaves the woman behind until the Count arrives. Tama's dissatisfaction grows with this situation. To see the Count take action with the shy guys. And the innocent young lady stirs Tamako's blood, and she wished she hadn't come to this horrible place, because she fell in love with him. The turning point comes to Tamako. After being instructed by the Count to collect oil for painting, she returns to find the lady upstairs of Count. This scene was too unbearable for Tamako, and she quickly ran away. After reading all night, the woman calls Tamako to her room, but Tamako goes first. She doesn't want to come, but she does. Mrs. Hideko scolds her maid for not doing it. She also greeted me after the book club. She then instructs her to sleep on her side. At her bedside, Mrs. Hideko tells her handmaiden that the Earl has already proposed to elope with her. Then she asks Tamako what happened after marriage. Tamako teaches her something. As a matter of fact, they started with a kiss that eventually turned into a night of joy. The next day, the Count tries to attack Mrs. Hideko while she is painting a picture, but Mrs. Hideko attacks her. Not comfortable. The Earl gives Tamako a coin and tries to kick her out of her room. However, Tamako chooses to stay against his will. So the Earl scolded Tamako in the forest. Tell her that if she doesn't follow through with her plan, all of her will benefit. None. Tamako replies that the Earl shouldn't force Hideko-sama that much to carry out the plan. That night, Tamako gives the young lady her foot massage and tries hard to make her think like a young lady. Count. However, Mrs. Hideko does not put up with it, and she tells Tamako that she does not love the Count. Still, the woman slaps her face to Tamako, who insists on her number, and kick her out of her room. Then Tamako cries. In the next scene, Tamako speaks. Lady finally accepts the Count's offer to flee to Japan under the following conditions. Tamako will come too. The day Hideko-sama's uncle left the mansion to go to the mine, the lady and her servant decided to leave the house at night. After exploring some terrain, the movie begins with the three already on board a ship bound for Japan. Immediately after arriving in Japan, Mrs. Hideko and the Earl secretly get married. Position. That night, Tamako prepares for her honeymoon with the Earl. After that, she tells Tamako that Earl has paid the innkeeper to protect her. He didn't show up at the house because the Earl was busy cashing in her wife's inheritance. A week passed, and the Earl finally got his wife's inheritance. Soon after, two men from Kyojinin go to the inn and interrogate Tamako about the woman. After a short interview, the three head to Mad Cow Ward. When they get there, the gray wall of the housing complex envelops the lady's Tamako. But when Tamako notices the place, women quickly move away from Tamako. However, facility staff quickly intervened. Octopus instead, the Earl suddenly tells the staff that Tamako is a young lady, and that she suffers from her delusion that she is a Korean maid. Then Tamako says, Mrs. Hideko has always been a bad woman. A flashback occurs, revealing a young Hideko. She takes punishment from her cruel uncle. Flashbacks also reveal Hideko's close relationship with her. Besides, her aunt is a spoiled brat. A reading session with her uncle turned out. Actually, it is a reading of erotic novels, and it is read aloud in front of male customers at night. One of the regular customers is the Earl, who eventually meets Mrs. Hideko. At first he admitted that he intended to seduce her, but changed her mind. He then offers her a deal that he will set Mrs. Hideko free by marrying him. Hideko. Wanting to escape, she accepts her deal and tells the Count that she needs a maid to take over her position. This is where Tamako comes into play. The secret seemed fine at first, but, however, in the end, Mrs. Hideko also wins against Tamako. The night Mrs. Hideko throws. It was the same night that her wife decided to take her own life that kicked her maid out of her room. Straight away, she gets a rope from her room and decides to hang it on the same tree where her aunt was hanged. But just before she can continue, Tamako manages to hold her down. Tamako apologizes to him, lady who tricked her and revealed the details of her plan. Mrs. Hideko tells her maid that she is secretly deceived. Another development. Mrs. Hideko and Tamako decide to join forces. Tamako emails her family about the change of plans. On the day her uncle left the mansion, Mrs. Hideko takes her Tamako to the library. There, Tamako learns of the existence of a loathsome book club. As a result, Tamako destroyed the book inside. Returning to the present, Mrs. Hideko and the Earl have lunch at a restaurant. The Count tells his wife, Hideko, to remarry, this time under the name of Tamako. In the meantime, the Count puts something in his drink, after handing over the wine that Hideko-sama brewed. Finally, the kiss puts the Earl to sleep before he can move. After that, the woman finally left. The Count gets up at 2 o'clock the next day. A Japanese man threatened him. Meanwhile, the two women are together again. Then Hideko. She decides to disguise herself as a man so that her uncle's minions won't find her. The Count is then escorted to a mansion to be tortured by Mrs. Hideko's uncle because he was deceived by two women. Meanwhile, the two women manage to avoid detection. Change destination to Shanghai. I went back to the basement where Hideko-sama was. The uncle tortures the Count, and the damned old man wants to listen to her niece's lascivious act. But before we can talk, the Count wants to smoke. The Earl then refused to tell the story when her uncle tried to cut something. On the Count's body, he noticed a blue glow emanating from the Count's cigarettes. The Earl then reveals that his cigarettes contain mercury. Uncle dies, and the Count finally followed him too. The movie ends with two women. They celebrate their freedom by sleeping together on board. The movie ends here. Subscribe for more videos, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel. Thank you for watching.